Shaquille O'Neal decides to go undercover as a homeless man to test society's reactions. What he experiences will uncover harsh truths and spark change. Subscribe and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. The late afternoon sunlight poured through the windows of Shaquille O'Neal's study, bathing the room in a golden glow. A thick silence hung in the air, broken only by the faint rustle of a newspaper being turned. Shaquille sat in his favorite armchair, the leather creaking slightly under his weight as he shifted. His eyes scanned the headline with a furrowed brow: Spike in complaints of racial discrimination across the nation. The accompanying article delved into harrowing accounts of injustice, discrimination, and systemic biases faced by countless individuals every day. One story struck him harder than the rest. A young African-American man had been accused of stealing from a supermarket. Despite evidence proving his innocence, the damage was already done. His reputation tarnished, his future uncertain. Shaquille's hands clenched involuntarily, crumpling the edge of the newspaper. The words on the page blurred as memories he thought he had buried long ago resurfaced. It was as if he was 15 again, walking into that convenience store after basketball practice. The ding of the doorbell still echoed in his mind. He had only stopped to buy a drink and a candy bar, yet the way the store clerk's eyes followed him felt like he was walking under a spotlight. The memory was vivid, down to the cheap vinyl smell of the store floor and the fluorescent light flickering overhead. He had done nothing wrong, yet the security guard's accusation, sharp and baseless, still rang in his ears. "Don't think I didn't see you stuffing your pockets," the guard had said, his voice laced with disdain. The humiliation of that moment was burned into Shaquille's soul. He remembered how his mother's words had comforted him later that night. "You are not what they see. You are more, but you have to show them." Now, decades later, he sat in his mansion, surrounded by trophies and accolades that proved he had risen above such moments. Yet, reading the article, he felt the same bitter sting of injustice. It wasn't enough to rise above it. Something needed to change. As the sunlight dimmed and the room plunged into shadow, Shaquille made a decision. He was no stranger to the spotlight or the power of his platform. This was a moment to use both, to shine a light on a problem that had plagued him and countless others for generations. He needed to understand the problem from a perspective he had left behind. Not as Shaquille O'Neal, the basketball legend, but as an ordinary man, or perhaps even someone beneath notice. The idea formed quickly. He would become invisible, shedding the recognizable identity that opened doors and protected him from much of life's harsher realities. What if he could step into the shoes of someone marginalized, someone dismissed, overlooked, or actively shunned? The thought invigorated him, but it also filled him with a creeping unease. The world was a different place when people didn't recognize you, or worse, judged you before you even spoke. The next day, Shaquille called his team into action. Stylists, makeup artists, and a documentary crew that specialized in hidden cameras gathered at his house. As they prepared their tools, Shaquille outlined his vision for the experiment. He spoke with a passion that silenced any doubts. He wanted to see the world through the eyes of those who face these injustices every day. He wanted the truth, raw, unfiltered, and unflattering. And he wanted to share it with the world. The transformation began. Shaquille sat motionless in a chair as the team worked tirelessly. Layers of makeup and prosthetics transformed his familiar features into the weathered visage of an older, frail man. His skin, once radiant and well-groomed, appeared rough and ashen under their expert hands. They grayed his hair and added a scruffy beard. His broad shoulders were hidden beneath oversized, tattered clothes. His large, polished sneakers were replaced with a pair of worn, mismatched trainers that barely clung to his feet. He looked in the mirror and barely recognized the man staring back. Gone was the towering figure of confidence. In its place stood a shadow of someone society would avoid meeting eyes with, a tired, broken figure clutching a plastic bag filled with what little belongings he owned. As the final touches were applied, Shaquille's mind churned with doubt. Would people see through the disguise? Would his celebrity status break the illusion? Or worse, would the harsh realities of this new role cut deeper than he expected? He shook the thoughts away. This wasn't about him. It was about understanding and exposing truths that others faced every day. By the time the transformation was complete, the sun had set and the city outside was alight with activity. Shaquille stepped out of his home, his heart pounding as he took his first steps into this new reality. The sprawling streets, once so familiar, now felt foreign. He avoided the main roads, opting instead for narrow alleyways and crowded sidewalks where anonymity came easier. The city was alive, its neon signs casting fragmented reflections on the wet pavement. People bustled past him, each lost in their own world. Yet, as he shuffled along, he began to notice how the crowd shifted. Some people walked faster as they approached him, clutching their belongings a little tighter. Others glanced at him briefly before averting their gaze, pretending he wasn't there. The space around him seemed to widen as though he carried an invisible barrier repelling everyone near. The air grew colder, not from the weather but from the collective indifference of those around him. The first real interaction of the night came when a woman and her young son crossed his path. The boy looked up at him with innocent curiosity, but the mother tightened her grip on the child's hand and whispered something before hurrying away. Shaquille caught the faintest hint of her words. "Don't stare, just keep walking." For the first time in years, Shaquille felt invisible. No, worse than invisible. He felt like an intrusion. He stopped near the entrance of a small convenience store, leaning against the wall to catch his breath. His legs ached, not from physical exertion but from the emotional weight of his surroundings. He decided to test a simple gesture, holding out his hand to a passerby, a kindly-looking older man. "Excuse me, sir," Shaquille said, his voice softer and rougher than usual. "Do you have some spare change?" The man barely slowed down, his expression one of disgust. "Get a job," he muttered, his voice laced with contempt. Shaquille stood there, stunned. The words hit harder than he expected, like a slap across the face. For a moment, he questioned his resolve to continue. If this was just the beginning, what more would he endure? The city around him buzzed with life, yet Shaquille felt utterly alone. This was only his first night, but already the weight of the experiment pressed heavily on his chest. He reminded himself of the purpose, of the countless faces and stories that had inspired him to take this step. He adjusted the strap of his plastic bag and continued walking, disappearing into the night. The cool night air clung to Shaquille's skin as he wandered the streets, his breath visible in small clouds as the temperature dipped. The vibrant city lights that once seemed warm and inviting now felt distant, casting long shadows across the pavement. He had spent hours roaming the urban sprawl, observing how people avoided his gaze, how they quickened their pace when passing him, and how the city seemed to hum with an unspoken indifference. His heart weighed heavily from the day's encounters, but the night was far from over. He found himself near a small strip of stores, their windows filled with bright advertisements for sales and holiday promotions. Shaquille's legs ached, his back sore from carrying the weight of his disguise and the emotional burden of the experiment. Spotting a set of steps leading up to a closed storefront, he decided to rest. The concrete was cold and rough, but it offered a moment of reprieve. He sank down onto the steps, clutching his plastic bag tightly as he scanned the street. The people passing by barely noticed him. Some glanced in his direction only to quickly look away, their expressions tinged with discomfort or disdain. Others didn't bother to acknowledge him at all, as though his presence blended seamlessly into the background noise of the city. Shaquille pulled his coat tighter around himself and leaned back, watching the ebb and flow of human traffic. Minutes turned to an hour, and Shaquille's thoughts began to drift. He replayed the events of the day, the countless slights and dismissive gestures he had endured. This wasn't new to him, not entirely. He had seen it before, in the way his parents were treated when he was a child, in the way people spoke to him before they knew who he was. But experiencing it so directly, so openly, had awakened something raw and visceral in him. He couldn't help but wonder how much worse it could get. His musings were interrupted by the sudden flash of red and blue lights reflecting off the storefront windows. The shrill sound of a police siren pierced the air, cutting through the ambient noise of the street. Shaquille stiffened, his heart pounding as a patrol car pulled up to the curb. The doors opened, and two officers stepped out. Even from a distance, their contrasting demeanors were evident. The younger officer, his uniform crisp and his movements brisk, exuded an air of authority that bordered on arrogance. His name tag read J. Brown. His partner, an older man with a graying beard and tired eyes, followed more slowly, his shoulders slightly hunched as though weighed down by years of experience. His name tag identified him as S. Gray. Shaquille didn't move, his instincts telling him to stay calm and quiet. He had anticipated an encounter like this. It was almost inevitable, but knowing it might happen didn't make it any less nerve-wracking. "Evening," Officer Brown said, his voice sharp and clipped. He stopped a few feet away, his hand resting casually on the holster of his weapon. His eyes swept over Shaquille with a mix of suspicion and disdain. "What are you doing here?" Shaquille met his gaze steadily, his voice calm but firm. "Just sitting. Resting my legs." Brown's lips twisted into a smirk. "Resting your legs, huh? You've been here a while. Somebody called in about a suspicious person loitering. That wouldn't happen to be you, would it?" Before Shaquille could respond, Officer Gray stepped forward, his tone softer but no less authoritative. "Let's keep this civil, Jimmy. He's not causing any trouble." Brown shot his partner a look but didn't back down. "Not yet. But it's people like him that scare folks around here. Sitting around like this, looking like that. It's no wonder they called us." Shaquille felt a flicker of anger rise within him, but he forced himself to remain composed. "I'm just sitting, officer. I'm not bothering anyone." Brown's smirk disappeared, replaced by a sneer. "You've got a smart mouth for someone in your position. You got ID?" Shaquille hesitated. He had prepared for this, but the reality of the situation still caught him off guard. He reached into his pocket, moving deliberately to avoid any sudden motions. "I don't have my ID on me," he said truthfully. "I'm not doing anything wrong." Brown stepped closer, his hand still on his holster. "That's the problem with you people. Always got an excuse. You're lucky I don't haul you in for vagrancy." Shaquille's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Gray placed a hand on Brown's arm, his expression one of quiet disapproval. Let it go, Jimmy. He's not doing anything illegal." Brown shrugged off Gray's hand and took another step forward, towering over Shaquille. "This isn't your call, old man. People like this are why this city's going to hell." The tension was palpable, the air thick with unspoken animosity. Shaquille rose slowly to his feet, his movements deliberate and measured. He stood taller than Brown, but his posture was relaxed, non-threatening. "If I'm making people uncomfortable, I'll move. There's no need for this." Brown's eyes narrowed, and for a moment it seemed like he might push the issue further. But Gray stepped between them, his voice firm. "That's enough, Jimmy. Let him go." Brown muttered something under his breath, but he finally stepped back, his hand leaving his holster. "Fine. But if I see you around here again, we're going to have a problem." Shaquille nodded, picking up his plastic bag and slinging it over his shoulder. He began to walk away, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't look back, but he could feel their eyes on him as he disappeared into the night. As he rounded the corner and slipped into a quieter street, Shaquille allowed himself a moment to breathe. The encounter had shaken him more than he cared to admit. The hostility in Brown's voice, the way he had been sized up and dismissed, it was a stark reminder of the reality he was immersing himself in, but it also solidified his resolve. This experiment wasn't just about observing, it was about exposing, and this was only the beginning. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement as Shaquille continued his trek through the city. The encounter with the police left him shaken, but also more determined to continue the experiment. His heart still raced, and the officer's sneering tone echoed in his mind. He replayed the moment repeatedly, the simmering anger within him battling against his resolve to remain calm. It wasn't just about him. It was about what this experiment represented. If he crumbled now, the purpose of his journey would be lost. The city began to shift around him as he wandered further into a different neighborhood. The buildings were taller here, cleaner, their polished glass facades reflecting the glow of neon signs and bright advertisements. The sidewalks were wider, the air carrying the scent of freshly baked bread and roasted coffee beans. The atmosphere felt more inviting, yet Shaquille knew better than to be deceived. His worn-out disguise made him an outsider no matter where he went. His stomach rumbled, a low, persistent reminder that he hadn't eaten all day. He scanned the area and spotted a small cafe nestled between two larger shops. The sign above the door read Maple Roast Cafe, its letters elegantly curved and warmly illuminated. Through the large windows, Shaquille could see patrons seated at wooden tables, sipping coffee and chatting in low voices. The cozy glow of the interior beckoned him, promising a brief respite from the cold and a chance to satisfy his growing hunger. As he pushed open the door, the warmth of the cafe enveloped him. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and baked goods was almost intoxicating. He took a moment to survey the space. The decor was simple but charming. Wooden furniture, soft lighting, and a chalkboard menu behind the counter. The patrons were a mix of young professionals typing away on laptops and older couples sharing quiet conversations. For a moment, Shaquille allowed himself to feel hopeful. Perhaps here he could blend in, just another customer seeking a cup of coffee and a moment of comfort. But the illusion shattered almost immediately. The barista behind the counter, a young woman with a sharp bob haircut and a neatly pressed apron, noticed him as he approached. Her smile faltered, replaced by a cautious expression that she quickly masked with a professionalism. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone neutral but edged with suspicion. Shaquille reached into his pocket and pulled out a few crumpled bills. "Just a coffee, please," he said, keeping his voice steady. "Black." The barista hesitated, her eyes darting to his clothes and the plastic bag in his hand. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Are you sure you can pay for it?" she asked, her voice quieter but no less pointed. A few heads turned at her question. The quiet hum of conversation in the cafe began to fade as the patrons took notice of the exchange. Shaquille felt their eyes on him, the weight of their judgment heavy on his shoulders. He swallowed hard, placing the bills on the counter. "I'm sure." The barista glanced at the money as though it might be counterfeit, then back at him. She didn't move to take it. Instead, she leaned closer, lowering her voice but making no effort to hide the disdain in her tone. "Look, if you're just here to cause trouble, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." "I'm not causing any trouble," Shaquille replied, his voice calm but firm. "I just want a cup of coffee." Before the barista could respond, a man seated near the counter chimed in. "People like him don't come in here to buy coffee," he said loudly, addressing the room rather than Shaquille directly. He was middle-aged, dressed in a crisp suit, and spoke with the confidence of someone used to having his opinions validated. "They just want to loiter or beg for money. You should kick him out." A ripple of agreement passed through the cafe, subtle nods and murmurs from other patrons. Shaquille clenched his jaw, resisting the urge to respond. He knew that anything he said would only escalate the situation. The barista straightened up, emboldened by the man's words. "I'm sorry," she said, her tone icy now. "I think you should leave." Shaquille stood there for a moment, the tension in the room pressing down on him. He felt the sting of humiliation, the heat of anger bubbling beneath the surface. But more than that, he felt a deep, aching sadness. This wasn't just about him. It was about the countless people who faced moments like this every day, without the safety net of a larger purpose or the knowledge that they could eventually return to a different life. "I understand," he said quietly, gathering his money and stepping away from the counter. The barista watched him go, her expression unreadable. The man in the suit smirked, leaning back in his chair as though he had won some unspoken battle. Shaquille pushed open the door and stepped back into the cold. The contrast between the warmth of the cafe and the chill of the night was stark, but he welcomed it. The icy air was grounding, a reminder of the reality he had willingly immersed himself in. He walked a few steps before stopping, leaning against the side of the building. His stomach growled again, but he ignored it, focusing instead on the emotions swirling within him. Anger, humiliation, sadness, empathy. He thought about the barista and the man in the suit, their words and actions so quick to dismiss him, to dehumanize him. He thought about the other patrons, their silence complicit in the injustice, and he thought about the real homeless people he had seen on his journey, who faced this treatment daily without reprieve. This experiment wasn't just revealing the ugliness of society, it was revealing the strength it took to survive it. He took a deep breath, straightened his posture, and continued walking. The night stretched on, the city alive with its contradictions, beauty and brutality, warmth and coldness, compassion and indifference. Shaquille had seen another side of it tonight, one he would carry with him as he moved forward. The cafe faded into the distance behind him, but its memory lingered. This was only one moment, one encounter. There would be more, he was certain of it, and he would face them all, not just for himself, but for the truth he sought to uncover. The streets were quieter now, the city beginning to settle into the late hours of the night. Shaquille's breath formed faint clouds in the cold air as he trudged onward, his thoughts still lingering on the events in the cafe. The humiliation he had felt, the unprovoked hostility, and the patronizing smirks from strangers, it all weighed heavily on his mind. He carried those moments with him, each one a stark reminder of the prejudice that thrived in the shadows of ordinary life. The occasional sound of laughter or the hum of a passing car broke the silence, but for the most part, the streets were deserted. Shaquille adjusted the strap of his plastic bag, the faint ache in his shoulders a dull reminder of the hours he'd spent walking. His stomach growled again, but he ignored it, focusing instead on the rhythm of his footsteps against the pavement. As he passed through a narrow alley, the dim street lights gave way to flickering neon signs and the distant sound of music. He had entered a less polished part of the city, where the atmosphere shifted from quiet indifference to a tense, unpredictable energy. Graffiti-covered walls and boarded-up windows marked the neighborhood, and the faint smell of alcohol and smoke lingered in the air. Shaquille kept his head down, his pace steady but unhurried. He knew that in places like this, drawing attention to oneself could invite trouble. But trouble had a way of finding him tonight, no matter how careful he tried to be. As he turned a corner, a group of young men emerged from the shadows, their voices loud and brash. There were 5 of them, dressed in a mix of hoodies and jackets, their body language exuding a mix of arrogance and aggression. They occupied the sidewalk like they owned it, their laughter echoing in the stillness of the night. Shaquille's heart sank as he realized there was no easy way to avoid them. Crossing the street would only draw attention, and turning back wasn't an option. He tightened his grip on the strap of his bag and kept walking, hoping they would let him pass without incident. But as he drew closer, their laughter subsided, replaced by low murmurs and pointed glances in his direction. One of them, a wiry young man with a shaved head and a tattoo on his neck, stepped forward, blocking Shaquille's path. "Hey, old man," the young man said, his voice dripping with mockery, "what are you doing out here? Shouldn't you be curled up in a box somewhere?" The others laughed, their voices sharp and cruel. Shaquille stopped, his eyes meeting the young man's for a brief moment before lowering his gaze. He knew better than to escalate the situation. "Just passing through," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. "Passing through, huh?" Another one chimed in, a stocky man with a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. "You're on the wrong street for that. This is our spot." Shaquille said nothing, his instincts telling him to stay calm, but his silence seemed to provoke them further. The wiry young man stepped closer, invading Shaquille's space. "What's in the bag?" he asked, his tone turning sharper. "You got something worth sharing?" "It's just some clothes," Shaquille replied, taking a step back. "Nothing valuable." "Clothes, huh?" the stocky man said with a sneer. "Let's see for ourselves." Before Shaquille could react, the wiry man grabbed the bag from his shoulder and tore it open, spilling its contents onto the ground. A few old shirts and a pair of worn socks tumbled out, landing in a pathetic heap on the sidewalk. The group burst into laughter, the sound echoing like nails on a chalkboard. "Man, this is sad," one of them said, kicking the pile of clothes. "You're not even worth robbing." Shaquille clenched his fists, his body tensing with suppressed anger. He wanted to say something, to defend himself, but he knew it would only make things worse. These young men were looking for a fight, and he had no intention of giving them one. As the group continued to jeer and mock him, a voice rang out from behind them. "Hey, leave him alone." The laughter stopped abruptly, and the group turned to face the newcomer. It was a man in his late 30s wearing a heavy jacket and a knit cap. He stood a few feet away, his expression firm and unyielding. "You've had your fun. Now move along." The wiry man sneered, his bravado faltering only slightly. "What's it to you? This ain't your business." "It is now," the man said, stepping closer. His tone was calm but resolute, and there was something in his stance that made the group hesitate. "You want to mess with someone? Try me." For a moment, the tension hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Then, with a muttered curse, the wiry man backed off, motioning for the others to follow. "Let's go. This loser's not worth it." One by one, they retreated, their laughter fading into the distance as they disappeared down the street. Shaquille let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his shoulders slumping with relief. "You okay?" the man asked, stepping closer. His voice was gentler now, his concern evident. Shaquille nodded, his voice hoarse. "Yeah, thank you. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in." The man shrugged, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Nobody deserves to be treated like that. You take care of yourself, all right?" Shaquille watched as the man walked away, disappearing into the night. For a moment, he stood there, staring at the scattered clothes on the ground. Slowly, he bent down and began gathering them, stuffing them back into the torn bag. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the overwhelming mix of emotions coursing through him. The encounter had shaken him deeply, but it had also reminded him of something important. Even in the midst of cruelty and indifference, there were still people who cared, who were willing to stand up for what was right. It was a small glimmer of hope, but it was enough to keep him moving forward. As he walked away from the scene, the city seemed quieter, the night air colder. The weight of his journey pressed heavily on him, but his resolve remained unbroken. He had seen the worst and the best of humanity tonight, and he knew there was still much more to uncover. The night wore on, the chill in the air growing sharper as Shaquille moved deeper into the city. His mind churned with thoughts of the encounter with the aggressive group. Their hostility had rattled him, but it was the stranger's intervention that lingered in his mind. There was a strange comfort in knowing that even in a world steeped in prejudice, there were still those who chose to do the right thing. That thought gave him a flicker of strength as he pressed forward, determined to see his experiment through. The city around him began to transform again, the graffiti-streaked alleys giving way to cleaner, well-lit streets. Luxury cars lined the curbs, and the glow of high-end storefronts bathed the sidewalks in soft golden light. This was a wealthier neighborhood, where the atmosphere felt less tense but no less unwelcoming. Shaquille could feel the weight of judgment in the gazes of the few people he passed, their eyes lingering on his disheveled appearance before quickly looking away. He walked aimlessly for a while, the events of the night catching up to him. Fatigue pulled at his limbs, and the hunger that had gnawed at him earlier now felt like a dull, constant ache. His feet ached with every step, but he pushed on, knowing he couldn't afford to stop. Not yet. Eventually, he found himself in front of a small park, its wrought iron gate standing slightly ajar. Inside, the faint glow of a street lamp illuminated a row of benches and the skeletal outlines of barren trees. The park was deserted, its stillness offering a moment of respite from the bustling streets. Shaquille slipped through the gate and made his way to a bench near the center, easing himself down with a sigh. The cold seeped through the wooden slats, but he didn't care. For the first time in hours, he allowed himself to close his eyes his body sinking into the relative quiet of the night. The distant hum of traffic and the occasional bark of a dog were the only sounds, and for a moment he almost felt at peace. But peace was fleeting. The sound of tires crunching against gravel pulled him from his brief reprieve. He opened his eyes to see a police cruiser rolling slowly into the park, its headlights cutting through the darkness. His chest tightened as the car came to a stop a few yards away, the doors opening in near unison. Two officers stepped out, their uniforms crisp and their movements deliberate. Shaquille recognized one of them immediately, Officer Jimmy Brown. The younger cop's swagger was unmistakable, his hand resting on his holstered weapon as he scanned the park. His partner, Officer Stephen Gray, followed a step behind, his expression weary but cautious. Shaquille's heart sank. Of all the officers he could encounter again, it had to be them. Brown spotted him first, his eyes narrowing as he strode forward. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice laced with mockery. "Look who we have here. You just can't seem to stay out of trouble, can you?" Shaquille stayed seated, forcing himself to remain calm. "I'm just resting," he said evenly, his voice steady despite the tension in his chest. "Resting," Brown repeated, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "In the middle of the night, in a park that's technically closed? That's called loitering." Gray stepped closer, his gaze flicking between Brown and Shaquille. "Jimmy, let's not make this a thing. He's not hurting anyone." But Brown wasn't listening. He took another step forward, his hand moving to unclip the strap on his holster. "Let me guess, you don't have ID on you either, just like last time." Shaquille met his gaze, his voice firm but measured. "I'm not breaking any laws." "That's debatable," Brown shot back, "and you're starting to become a real problem in this area." Gray sighed, placing a hand on Brown's shoulder. "Jimmy, let's just talk to him. There's no need to escalate this." But Brown shrugged him off, his frustration evident. "This isn't about talking, Steve. People like him are why we get called out here in the first place. He's either drunk, high, or up to no good. Probably all three." The accusation hung in the air, sharp and baseless. Shaquille felt his anger stir, but he forced it down, knowing that any outburst would only make things worse. "I'm not doing anything wrong," he said again, his voice steady but firm. Brown took another step closer, his posture aggressive. "Stand up," he ordered. "Now." Shaquille hesitated. Every instinct told him to comply, to avoid making the situation worse. But a part of him bristled at the demand, at the way Brown looked at him like he was less than human. Slowly, he rose to his feet, his movements deliberate. "Turn out your pockets," Brown said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Shaquille complied, pulling out a few crumpled bills and a receipt from the cafe. Brown snatched the items from his hand, inspecting them with exaggerated scrutiny before tossing them to the ground. "That's all you've got?" Brown sneered. "Not even enough for a decent meal. Figures." "Jimmy," Gray said sharply, stepping between them, "that's enough. He hasn't done anything wrong." But Brown wasn't finished. "We're taking him in," he said, reaching for his handcuffs. "He's a public nuisance." Shaquille's pulse quickened as he took a step back, his voice rising slightly. "I haven't done anything illegal. You can't arrest me for sitting on a bench." "You want to test me?" Brown snapped, his eyes blazing. "Because I can make something up real quick." "Jimmy," Gray's voice cut through the tension, his tone firm. "That's not how we do things." For a moment, the two officers stared at each other, the air between them charged with unspoken conflict. Then, with a frustrated growl, Brown stepped back, his hand leaving his holster. "Fine," he muttered, "but if I see him here again, he's going in." Gray exhaled, turning to Shaquille with an apologetic look. "You're free to go," he said quietly. "Just be careful." Shaquille nodded, his body tense as he bent down to pick up the crumpled bills and receipt. He didn't look at Brown as he walked away, his steps measured and deliberate. He could feel the officer's eyes on his back, the weight of their judgment following him into the night. As he exited the park and stepped back onto the city streets, Shaquille allowed himself a shaky breath. The encounter had left him shaken, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. But it had also strengthened his resolve. This experiment wasn't just about observation. It was about exposing the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. He adjusted the strap of his bag and kept walking, the city's lights guiding his path. The night was far from over, and there was still much to uncover. The events of the night still weighed heavily on Shaquille as dawn began to break over the city. The cold, gray light of morning illuminated the streets, washing away the shadows of the night but leaving behind the memories of everything he had endured. The second encounter with Officer Jimmy Brown replayed in his mind like a bad dream. His condescension, the baseless accusations, and the threat of arrest for no reason other than existing. It was a stark reminder of the systemic problems he had set out to expose. As the city awoke, Shaquille found himself back in the heart of downtown, the streets bustling with early morning activity. People hurried to work, their faces set in determined expressions as they navigated the sidewalks. The contrast between their brisk, purposeful movements and his own slow, weary steps was striking. He felt invisible, an unwelcome presence in a world that had no place for him. But Shaquille wasn't truly invisible, not this time. The experiment, which had started as an idea to shed light on systemic discrimination, was about to take on a life of its own. The hidden cameras that had been capturing his journey so far were doing their job, documenting every interaction, every moment of hostility, and every flicker of compassion. What Shaquille didn't yet realize was that one of those moments, the second encounter with Officer Brown, was already starting to ripple beyond the confines of his immediate experience. Unknown to him, a passerby had filmed the entire interaction on their phone. The video, showing Brown's aggressive behavior and Shaquille's calm, measured responses, had been uploaded to social media within hours. The footage quickly gained traction, shared by thousands and sparking a heated conversation online. The hashtags #JusticeForAll and #EndSystemic Racism began trending as people across the country reacted to the video with a mix of outrage and solidarity. Shaquille, still immersed in his experiment, remained unaware of the storm brewing online. He had no idea that his disguised self had become a symbol for something much larger. His focus was still on navigating the streets, trying to make sense of the world from this new perspective. But as the hours passed, the city began to feel different. The same streets that had seemed indifferent to him now felt charged with an energy he couldn't quite place. It wasn't until later that morning, as he sat on a bench in a small park, that he caught the first glimpse of what was happening. A group of teenagers nearby was huddled around a phone, their voices animated as they discussed something. One of them glanced in his direction, their eyes widening slightly before quickly looking away. Shaquille noticed the subtle exchange, but didn't think much of it at first. It wasn't until he heard one of them say, "That's him," that his curiosity was piqued. He stood and began walking toward them, his movements slow and deliberate. The teenagers fell silent as he approached, their eyes darting between him and the phone. "What's going on?" Shaquille asked, his voice calm but firm. One of them hesitated before holding out the phone. "It's you," they said, showing him the screen. Shaquille's heart skipped a beat as he saw the video playing on the device. It was the interaction with Officer Brown, captured from a distance but clear enough to see everything. The captions and hashtags below the video told him all he needed to know. This wasn't just an isolated moment anymore. It was part of a larger conversation, one that was quickly spiraling beyond his control. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. The teenagers watched him expectantly, their expressions a mix of curiosity and admiration. Finally, he handed the phone back, his mind racing. "Thank you," he said simply before turning and walking away. The weight of what was happening began to settle on his shoulders as he made his way through the city. This experiment, which he had intended to be a quiet exploration of systemic injustice, had become something much bigger. The world was watching now, and with that attention came both an opportunity and a responsibility. Shaquille knew he couldn't remain anonymous for much longer. The time was coming when he would have to step out of the shadows and reveal himself, but he wasn't ready yet. There was still more to do, more to understand. As the day went on, the buzz around the video grew louder. News outlets picked up the story, analyzing the footage and debating its implications. Activists and public figures weighed in, using the video as a rallying cry for justice. Meanwhile, Shaquille continued his journey, observing the world from his carefully crafted disguise. Later that afternoon, he found himself near a busy intersection where a group of protesters had gathered. They held signs with messages like "Justice for All" and "End Police Brutality," their voices raised in chants that echoed through the streets. Shaquille stopped at the edge of the crowd, watching as they marched and shouted, their passion palpable. For the first time in days, he felt a flicker of hope. But that hope was tempered by the reality of what he had experienced. He knew that one viral video wouldn't be enough to change the system. It was a start, but real change required more. More voices, more action, and more accountability. And as he stood there, blending into the background of the protest, he began to formulate a plan. The first step was revealing himself. He couldn't stay in disguise forever. If the world was already paying attention, he needed to use that attention to amplify the message. But he also knew that the reveal had to be meaningful. It wasn't enough to simply step forward and say, "Here I am." He needed to show the full scope of what he had witnessed and experienced. By the time the sun began to set, Shaquille had made up his mind. He would end the experiment the following day with a press conference. He would step out of his disguise and share his story, not as a victim, but as a witness to the systemic issues that needed to be addressed. And he would use the platform he had built, not as Shaquille O'Neal the celebrity, but as an advocate for justice. As night fell, he found a quiet spot to rest, his thoughts consumed by the events of the day and the decisions that lay ahead. The city around him seemed quieter now, as though holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. And, for the first time in days, Shaquille felt a sense of clarity. The experiment was almost over, but the real work was just beginning. The following morning dawned crisp and clear, the sunlight spilling across the city as if trying to cleanse it of the shadows that had lingered the night before. Shaquille sat on a park bench, his disguise still intact as he watched the city begin to stir. Joggers passed by with earbuds in, parents pushed strollers, and the occasional dog walker offered a polite nod before continuing on their way. This morning felt different, as if the air itself carried the weight of expectation. He knew what lay ahead. The decision he had made the night before was firm. Today was the day he would end the experiment and reveal himself to the world. The viral video, the growing protests, and the countless messages of support and outrage that had flooded social media demanded it. This was no longer just about his experience. It was about the broader conversation that his journey had ignited. Shaquille adjusted the strap of his tattered bag and rose from the bench. His steps were purposeful as he made his way toward the location he had chosen for the press conference, a modest community center in the heart of the city. It was a place that had seen its share of struggles, but had also been a beacon of hope for those who needed it most. The symbolism was not lost on him. When he arrived, the scene was already bustling with activity. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes pointed skyward, while reporters and camera crews milled about, preparing for the event. A small stage had been set up in front of the community center, flanked by a pair of microphones and a modest banner that read, "Justice and Awareness, a Call for Change." Shaquille lingered on the outskirts of the crowd, observing the energy that filled the air. People had gathered in droves, activists, community leaders, and everyday citizens drawn by the promise of something significant. Many held signs with messages of solidarity, their faces a mix of anger and hope. This was what he had wanted, a platform to shed light on the injustices he had witnessed and to push for meaningful reform. But before he could step into the spotlight, there was one last thing he needed to do. He slipped into the community center through a side entrance where a small team of his closest allies was waiting. Among them was his trusted manager, who had been instrumental in organizing the event and ensuring that everything ran smoothly. "Are you ready?" his manager asked, her voice calm but tinged with concern. Shaquille nodded, his expression resolute. "It's time." With the help of a makeup artist, he began to shed the layers of his disguise. The prosthetics, the grayed hair, the tattered clothes, each piece came off, revealing the man beneath. When the transformation was complete, he stood in front of a mirror, studying his reflection. It was a strange feeling, seeing himself again after days of inhabiting another identity. But this wasn't just about returning to who he was. It was about using his true self to amplify a message that needed to be heard. When he stepped out onto the stage, the crowd erupted into applause. The cameras flashed, their lenses trained on him as he approached the microphones. He paused for a moment, letting the energy of the moment wash over him before taking a deep breath and beginning to speak. "I stand before you today, not as Shaquille O'Neal, the basketball player, but as a man who has witnessed the harsh realities of our society in a way I never thought possible," he began, his voice steady and filled with conviction. "Over the past week, I've walked the streets of this city disguised as someone many of us choose to ignore. A homeless man, a person without status, a figure that too often becomes invisible in the eyes of society." He went on to recount his experiences, the cold indifference of passers-by, the hostility from law enforcement, and the blatant discrimination he had faced. He described the moments of kindness as well, highlighting the stranger who had stood up for him and the protesters who had rallied for change. Each story painted a vivid picture of a society fractured by prejudice, but not beyond hope. "The experiment wasn't just about me," he continued. "It was about shedding light on the systemic issues that plague our communities, issues that affect millions of people every day. And it's about asking ourselves a difficult question. What are we going to do about it?" The crowd listened intently, their faces reflecting a range of emotions: anger, sadness, determination. Shaquille's words carried weight, not just because of his celebrity status, but because of the raw honesty with which he spoke. He wasn't just telling his story. He was challenging everyone to take action. As he reached the conclusion of his speech, he announced the creation of a new initiative, the Shaquille O'Neal Foundation for Justice and Equality. The foundation would focus on 3 key areas: support for victims of discrimination, resources for the homeless, and education programs aimed at fostering empathy and understanding among law enforcement officers. "This isn't just about raising awareness," he said, his voice rising with passion. "It's about creating real, tangible change, and I can't do it alone. This is a fight that requires all of us, every voice, every action, every bit of effort, to build a society where justice truly means justice for all." The applause that followed was thunderous, the crowd rising to their feet in a wave of support. Reporters shouted questions, their voices blending into a cacophony of sound. But Shaquille held up a hand to quiet them. "I'll take your questions in a moment," he said. "But first, I want to say one more thing. To anyone out there who has ever felt invisible, overlooked, or dismissed, I see you. Your life has value. Your story matters. And together, we can make sure the world sees it too." As he stepped back from the microphones, the crowd surged forward, their energy electric. The press conference marked the end of his experiment, but it was clear that it was only the beginning of something much larger. The momentum he had built was undeniable, and Shaquille was determined to use it to push for meaningful reform. Over the following days, the impact of his speech reverberated across the nation. The video of the press conference went viral, sparking a wave of conversations about systemic injustice and the need for change. Donations poured into the foundation, and community leaders reached out to collaborate on initiatives. Even law enforcement agencies began to take notice, with some expressing interest in adopting the educational programs Shaquille had proposed. But perhaps the most significant change was the one he saw in the people around him. On the streets, in the news, and in the halls of power, there was a renewed sense of urgency, a collective realization that the status quo was no longer acceptable. And while the road ahead was long, Shaquille knew that they had taken an important first step. In the final scene, Shaquille returned to the neighborhood where his experiment had begun. He walked the streets, this time without a disguise, greeting people with a smile and stopping to talk with those he passed. At one corner, he paused to place a small plaque on the wall, a simple gesture to mark the journey he had taken. The plaque read, "Your life matters. Your voice matters. Together we rise." As he stood there, a group of children ran by, their laughter filling the air. It was a small moment, but it carried a profound message. Hope wasn't just possible. It was already here, growing in the cracks of a broken system waiting to be nurtured into something stronger. And with that, Shaquille walked away, ready to face whatever came next. Thank you for watching. If this story resonated with you, make sure to subscribe and explore more impactful stories on our channel. Share this video with someone who needs to see it, and let's keep the conversation going. Together, we can make a difference.